Hey there, welcome to a new episode of WeighOut Wednesday. My name is Dr. Ashley Southard. I'm the site director and clinical therapist at a New Beginning Outpatient Treatment Center and also the co-founder and program director of the Healthy Way Out Emotional and Binge Eating Weight Loss Program. Now, this month, the kids are out of school, they're home, they're at summer camp, and so I thought it was only appropriate to dedicate this month's episodes to talking about how we as adults can support children and teenagers who are struggling with binge eating disorder. We don't want to forget about these kiddos who are also finding themselves turning to food for comfort and relief. Now, preliminary research shows that about 1 to 2% of children and teenagers meet the criteria for the diagnosis of binge eating disorder. That's a little less than the general adult population, which is about 3.5%. And just like the adults, we know that there's a much larger percentage of children and teenagers who meet the subclinical diagnostic criteria, meaning they don't meet the full criteria for binge eating disorder, but they may still have a relationship with food in which they're using food for emotional purposes and eating more than their body is physically wanting. Now, in general, our understanding of binge eating disorder is that it typically develops in the late teens, early 20s. However, as a clinical therapist myself who specializes in binge eating disorder, we are finding children coming into our practice younger and younger and younger who are struggling with this very issue. So anymore, it's not uncommon for us to be working with children who are 7, 8, 9, 10 who are using food as a way to find emotional comfort and relief. So, what I want to talk about today are the warning signs that you, as the parent, the guardian, or the loved one, can watch for to really assess if your child or teenager is potentially struggling with binge eating disorder, emotional eating, or compulsive overeating. So, let's start with the diagnostic criteria of binge eating disorder, which was just added to the DSM only 5 years ago. So this is a relatively new diagnosis, and that's partially why we don't have as much research about it yet to quite understand how this is showing up for children. But what we know about binge eating disorder is that it's defined by recurrent episodes of binge eating, and a binge is defined loosely by eating a large amount of food in a relatively short period of time. Now, they don't define what large and short means because that's going to be specific for each individual person. So, relatively large amount of food, whatever that would be for your child, in a relatively short period of time, whatever that would be for your child. There's also this emotional quality around the experience of eating in which the person feels out of control. So they feel like they cannot stop eating, even though they may be feeling full, even though they may want to stop. Okay? Binge eating is also defined by eating really quickly and eating well past the point of physical satisfaction or fullness, to the point where you're actually really uncomfortable in your own body. Binges almost always happen alone in isolation, so you wouldn't necessarily see your child or teenager engaging in the act of binging. And typically, then the binge eating episode, the person experiences this sense of feeling disgusted, feeling really depressed or guilty as a result of their eating behavior. Now, the DSM would say that in order to meet this criteria, a person has to binge at least once a week for 3 consecutive months. If they're binging less than that, then they would meet the subclinical criteria, meaning they're still binging, but it's not happening enough to warrant the full-blown diagnosis. So those are the very formal diagnostic criteria that a child or an adolescent would have to meet in order to be diagnosed with binge eating disorder. But the problem with the things that I just mentioned is that most of the time this happens in isolation. This happens in private. There's so much shame around binge eating. So the child or the teenager isn't going to be doing this around you. So it'd be really hard for you to know if they are binging, if it's happening really quickly, if they're feeling uncomfortably full, if they're feeling disgusted, because you may not even know it's happening. So, I want to offer you some other signs, some observable warning signs that you can watch for in your own child that may suggest that there is some type of binge eating or compulsive overeating or emotional eating happening. And if you see these warning signs, then you know that it's time to reach out for some support so that hopefully your child can resolve these issues before this turns into something that they take with them into adulthood. So, the first observable warning sign that many parents will discover that will actually be one of the things that will really tip them off to there being some type of problem is finding an excessive amount of empty food wrappers in the child's space. And what I mean by that is when you go into their room or you go into their closet, their bathroom, their backpack, maybe their car if they're old enough to drive, what you find is a lot of different food wrappers that have been tucked away. So if you go into their closet, you may find an empty bag of chips in the corner. If you look under their bed, you may find an empty package of cookies. If you look under their bathroom sink, you may find an empty carton of ice cream. If you go into their car, if they're old enough to drive, you find a couple of different fast food wrappers and bags. So there's a lot of evidence that the child has been eating snack foods and kind of doing it in hiding. These aren't foods that you're necessarily seeing them eat on a regular basis. Now, in some families, these foods really are forbidden or off limits. So children aren't allowed to have cookies or chips or fast food or ice cream or whatever it may be. So the child is eating it in secrecy because they know they're not supposed to be eating it. In other families, these foods are perfectly acceptable to eat, but for whatever reason, the child feels ashamed of eating these foods, and so they hide them and they hide the wrappers in the hopes that you won't find that out. Okay, so that's really a key observable warning sign. If you see a lot of food wrappers in your child's space, you definitely want to approach them about it, but do it in a very gentle way. And I'm going to talk about that in future episodes, how exactly to support your child if you have some concerns. So, in addition to finding empty food wrappers, another observable warning sign parents can watch for is an obsession with food. And what I mean by that is your child is constantly focused on food. And we hear this a lot in adults who are struggling with binge eating as well. They are always thinking about food in some way, shape, or form. They're either thinking about what they've already eaten, what they're going to be eating, what they want to be eating, how they're going to get the next snack that they want to have. They're always thinking about food in some way, shape, or form. And the way this will show up with children is they'll be asking you, what are we having for dinner? When are we having dinner? Where are we going for dinner? What are we going to have for lunch on Saturday? When are you going to the store? I want to go to the store with you. And, children are always asking, when are we having dinner? What's for dinner? That's normal. But there is an obsessive quality a lot of times when people are thinking about food all the time. As a parent, you may feel like you're being bombarded with questions and comments related to food. Okay? A third observable warning sign you can watch for in your child is how quickly they're eating. So remember, one of the diagnostic criteria for binge eating disorder is that the person eats very quickly. Okay, so we also want to watch for this in children. So if they are sitting at the table eating dinner with the family and everyone else is kind of going at what we would consider maybe a normal pace, and the child is already done with their dinner and they've eaten it all, that may be a warning sign. All right, so you really want to watch for the speed at which they eat. And this is a consistent pattern you're wanting to look for. Certainly, adolescents tend to eat fast, especially hungry, growing adolescents. But this is something you want to watch for. Is this happening at pretty much every meal, or is this happening with certain types of foods? If you're seeing a pattern, then you may want to make note of it. But if this is just happening sporadically, or it's always happening right when they get home from school and you know that they're hungry after being at school all day, that makes a lot more sense. Okay, so really watch for those patterns that seem unusual to you. Another thing that you want to watch for is if your child is seeking out food when they're feeling distressed or overwhelmed. Okay? So if they are studying for a test and they're really stressed out, do you find that they're venturing into the kitchen, looking for the pantry, trying to find something that will help them feel better? All right, so you're watching them to see if they go and stand in front of the pantry, just kind of mindlessly looking for anything to munch on, or do they stand in front of the fridge just looking for anything? Do they make comments like, God, I'm so stressed out, I just need an ice cream sundae? Or I don't feel good, I'm going to eat McDonald's. So, really pay attention to any comments or behaviors that would suggest to you that they are connecting emotional discomfort with eating food to feel better. And if so, we want to gently intervene in a way that's supportive and non shaming. Okay? Another observable warning sign you can watch for is age inappropriate weight gain or change. Now, of course, children and teenagers are constantly growing. So we don't want to pathologize normal, healthy weight gain. Children grow out before they grow up. So before they hit puberty, it is very, very normal for children to gain quite a bit of weight before their body grows in height. This is really the weight gain is in preparation for puberty and for that growth spurt. So remember that as a parent, when you see your child gaining weight, don't panic. Most of the time, this is very, very normal. If you have concerns, go to your child's pediatrician, have them check them out, look on the growth chart. Most of the time, this is going to be very normal, healthy, and appropriate. We don't want to say anything or do anything about it. However, if you feel like this is age inappropriate weight gain, where they are gaining far more weight than is appropriate for where they're at developmentally, then you may want to get that checked out. Now, certainly, this is where a pediatrician can be very helpful because they can monitor that weight gain and they know what's appropriate and not appropriate. We also want to look for changes in weight. So, if you see your child's weight yo yoing, meaning it's going up and then down and then up and then down, we definitely want to check that out. Sometimes that can be a warning sign of binge eating disorder because they're eating a lot and then maybe they're restricting to compensate and then they're eating a lot and then they're restricting. So definitely watch for changes in your child's weight. Address it with the pediatrician first. We don't want to say anything to a child and give them some kind of complex about their weight, which can actually induce an eating disorder. So we don't want to do that. Check it out with the pediatrician first. If the pediatrician also has concerns, then we want to step in and start addressing it with the child, which is something I will get to in the next couple of episodes. Okay? The last observable warning sign that I want you to watch for are signs of depression and or anxiety. Now, if a child is depressed or anxious, that by no means indicates that they also are struggling with binge eating disorder. But what we do find is that for a lot of people struggling with binge eating disorder, they're also struggling with depression and anxiety. So we see those two go hand in hand a lot of the times. So look for a change in your child's mood. If suddenly they lose interest in things that they used to be really interested in, if suddenly they're worrying a lot about things that they used to not worry about, you want to get that checked out, okay? Now, it's really important for me to mention here that all of the signs that I just mentioned, independently of each other, may not indicate binge eating disorder at all, okay? So if you're finding empty food wrappers, that doesn't necessarily indicate binge eating disorder. If your child eats fast, that by no means indicates binge eating disorder. However, it's the constellation of these different observable warning signs that may then suggest binge eating disorder. So if you're finding a lot of empty food wrappers in your child's room and you're hearing a lot of obsessive thoughts about food and you're watching them eat fast and you're watching them go stand in front of the pantry when they're stressed out and overwhelmed, then I really want you to think about if this may be something that your child is struggling with. So just know that any one of these signs on their own doesn't necessarily indicate anything, but it's the coming together of several of these warning signs that can certainly cause us to pause. Okay? So, empty food wrappers, an obsession with food, eating really fast, seeking out food when feeling distressed or overwhelmed, age inappropriate weight gain or change, and signs of depression and or anxiety. If you're seeing all of these different components, then you may have a child who is struggling with binge eating disorder. So, what I'm going to do in the next several episodes is talk about how you, as the parent or the guardian or the loved one, can step in and support your child in a way that's not shaming, that's not going to make them feel bad, and that's not going to cause more eating problems down the road. All right, so stay tuned for some very handy tips about what you can do to help your child. In the meantime, spend this week really just kind of observing and seeing if you're noticing any of these warning signs in your child. All right? Have a wonderful week. I can't wait to be back here next week to offer you some tips of how to help your child. Have a wonderful week. Take care. Bye bye.